Sandra had spent the entire afternoon making everything perfect. Not because she was desperate, not because she needed to impress anyone, but because after 10 years of loving one man from a distance, she had convinced herself that the least she could do was make the night of his return feel like something worth coming home to. The apartment was warm, the kind of warm that comes from good food sitting on a stove and candles burning on a countertop. Sandra had cooked everything from scratch, jollof rice the way her mother taught her, grilled salmon with a honey glaze that she had practiced 3 times in the last month alone, and a small chocolate cake she almost didn't make but decided against at the last minute. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, not too formal, not casual either, just right. Her natural hair was pulled back in a style that framed her face the way she knew Danwoo always loved. Her skin, that smooth, fair brown that caught light easily, was moisturized, glowing, unhurried. She looked like a woman who had not been waiting 10 years. She looked like a woman who simply existed beautifully and happened to be expecting someone. That was the thing about Sandra. She never let the waiting show on her face. She was 29 years old, a senior financial consultant at a reputable firm in Midtown Manhattan, New York City, one of the most expensive and competitive financial markets in the entire country. She had built her career quietly and efficiently, the same way she did everything else in her life. She was the kind of woman that people in boardrooms respected without fully understanding why, and the kind of woman that strangers on the street glanced at twice, without knowing what exactly pulled their attention. She had a life, a real one, good friends, a career she was proud of, an apartment in Manhattan that she had furnished slowly and intentionally over 6 years until every corner of it felt like her. But underneath all of that, underneath the competence and the composure and the carefully built life, there was Danwoo Kwon. There had always been Danwoo. They met 12 years ago when Sandra was 17 and Danwoo was 19. His family had business ties in New York, and he spent 3 years in the United States during a critical period of his education and early training. They met at a mutual friend's birthday gathering in Brooklyn, a casual thing, paper plates and loud music and people spilling out onto a fire escape. Danwoo stood in the corner of the room looking like he belonged somewhere more important, and Sandra walked past him to get to the kitchen and said without even looking at him, "You look like you're calculating something." He looked at her, blinked, and then said, I'm calculating how long before everyone at this party realizes you're the most interesting person in the room." She rolled her eyes so hard she almost lost her balance, but she laughed. That was where it started. That laugh in a Brooklyn apartment with cheap decorations on the walls and somebody's playlist switching between reggaeton and R&B. They spent 3 years building something real, something that didn't have a label for a long time because it didn't need one. They were just Danwoo and Sandra. They walked through Central Park in the winter and argued about the best pizza spots in Manhattan and sat in his car outside her building for hours after dates because neither of them wanted to say goodnight. He met her mother. She met 2 of his cousins. It was quiet and deep and completely theirs. And then Danwoo's father called him back to Seoul. Not for a vacation, not for a brief family visit. His father, the head of the Kwon organization, one of the most powerful and privately held Korean business dynasties in existence, was facing an internal crisis. A fracture within the organization that threatened to split everything the family had built across 3 generations. He needed Danwoo, his heir, his most capable son. Danwoo came to Sandra the night before his flight. He sat across from her in this very apartment. It was smaller back then, a different unit on a lower floor, but it was hers and she had made it warm the same way she always did, and he told her the truth. That he had to go. That he did not know exactly how long it would take. That the situation was serious and he could not walk away from his family. Sandra listened. She did not cry. She was 22 years old and she understood what family responsibility meant. Then he asked her something. He held both of her hands across the table, and he looked at her the way he looked at her when he wasn't performing anything for anyone, just raw and honest, and he said, "Wait for me. I know it's not fair to ask, but wait for me, Sandra." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Don't make me regret it." He promised he wouldn't. That was 7 years ago. For the first 3 years, they maintained everything. Calls, video chats, Emails when the time zones made calls impossible. Danwoo flew back to New York twice, once for 5 days, once for 3, and both times he was present and warm and completely hers. He brought her a bracelet from Seoul on the first trip and a handmade journal on the second, and he sat in her apartment and ate her cooking and slept beside her like a man who was home. During those years, Sandra turned down 2 relationships. One was a man she met through a colleague, a kind, successful man named Andre who asked her to dinner 4 times before she finally told him she was emotionally unavailable. The other was a man in San Francisco who flew her out to California twice and showed her a life she could have had. Good life, beautiful apartment in Nob Hill, solid future. She came home both times and thought about Danwoo and chose the waiting. After the 3rd year, the calls started to slow. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. A week would pass between conversations instead of 2 days, then 2 weeks. Danwoo would apologize and explain that things in the organization were escalating, that his father's health was dipping and the pressure on him was enormous, that he was managing 40 things at once and he was sorry. He was always sorry, and Sandra always said it was fine, because it always was fine. Until it wasn't. 8 months ago, Danwoo went completely silent. No calls, no texts, no emails, nothing. Sandra sent him 3 messages across the first 2 weeks. Casual ones, not desperate, not dramatic, just checking in the way you check in on someone you love. She got no response. She told herself he was in the middle of something. She told herself the organization was in crisis again. She told herself there was a reasonable explanation. She kept waiting. And then tonight, this very night, with the food still warm on the stove, and the candles burning, and the burgundy dress, and the hair she did herself 3 times before she was satisfied, Sandra got a call from a mutual contact named Jerome, a man who moved between New York and Seoul in business circles and knew both of them peripherally. Jerome told her Danwoo had just landed at JFK Airport. Sandra's heart almost stopped beating in her chest. She looked around her apartment, at the table she had set, at the food, at the small card she had written nothing dramatic, just "Welcome home" in her handwriting because she thought it was better than silence. She breathed, she smiled, the first real smile in months. Jerome's voice on the phone was strange. There was something sitting underneath his words that she didn't catch because she was too focused on the smile spreading across her face. She thanked him, she hung up. She went to the bathroom mirror and checked her lipstick. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. A notification. From a New York social page she followed mostly for real estate listings and city news. She tapped it without thinking. A photo loaded. Danwoo, tall, commanding, moving through the arrivals terminal at JFK with that particular stride he had like the floor owed him something. Dark coat, eyes forward, looking exactly like the man she had been loving across 7 years of distance. And beside him, a woman. Korean, beautiful, elegant in that understated way that speaks of old money and careful grooming. Her hand was resting in the crook of his arm, not casually, the way you hold on to someone when they belong to you. The caption beneath the photo read, Korean business mogul Danwoo Kwon touches down in New York with a mystery woman. Sandra stood in her bathroom, holding her phone. The candles were still burning in the living room. The food on the stove was still warm. The card that said, "Welcome home," was still sitting on the table she had set for 2 people. And Sandra stood there in her burgundy dress with her hair done perfectly and her heart doing something that didn't have a name yet, something between devastation and a cold, quiet fury. Staring at a photo she found out about from a gossip page. Not from Danwoo. A gossip page. She set her phone face down on the bathroom counter. She looked at herself in the mirror for a very long time. And the woman looking back at her had eyes that were completely dry. Sandra spent 10 years holding on to a man who just walked off a plane with someone else on his arm. 10 years. And she found out through a gossip page. Now be honest, would you have waited that long? I really want to hear you out on this. Please answer in the comment. I will be waiting in the comment. Also go ahead and like the video. And if you're not subscribed yet, please go ahead and do so that you won't be missing good stories like this. Now let's continue. Sandra did not fall apart that night. She blew out the candles herself. She put the food in containers and stacked them neatly in her refrigerator. She washed the dishes she had used while cooking, dried them, and put them back in the cabinet. She folded the tablecloth. She put the card, the one that said "Welcome Home" in her own handwriting, into the small drawer beside her bed without tearing it up, without throwing it across the room, without crying over it. She was not performing calm. She actually felt it. The kind of calm that comes when something you were afraid of for years finally happens and your body just settles. Like a storm that spent so long building that when it finally hit, it was almost a relief. She got into bed. She stared at the ceiling for a while, and then she fell asleep. The next morning she got up, made coffee, went for a run along the East River, showered, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and tailored trousers, and went to work. She did not contact Danwoo. She decided she was going to wait, not with hope this time, not with longing, but with her eyes open. She was going to see what he did next. She was going to see whether this man who had asked her to wait for him had the decency to explain himself. Day 1 passed, nothing from Danwoo. Day 2, nothing. Day 3, her colleague Priya, who worked 2 floors above Sandra at the firm and had a particular talent for finding information nobody asked her to find, sent Sandra a screenshot over text with a message that just said, "Is this who I think it is?" The screenshot was from a social account that covered New York's business and social elite. A photo from a private dinner in Greenwich, Connecticut, hosted at the estate of one of New York's most prominent old money investment families. It was the kind of dinner that you only heard about if you were already in a certain room. Danwoo was in the photo, seated, composed, looking like he belonged at the head of every important table in the world because in most of the rooms he entered, he did. And beside him, the same woman from the airport photo. The caption identified her this time. Seo-yoon Lim, daughter of the Lim industrial family out of Seoul, described in the caption as Danwoo Kwon's close companion. Sandra read the words, "close companion," 3 times. She set her phone on her desk and went back to the financial report she was drafting for a client portfolio review. She finished the report. She sent it to her director. She got up and walked to the lobby cafe downstairs to get her second coffee of the morning. And she walked directly into Danwoo Kwon. He was in the lobby, standing near the elevator bank with a man Sandra didn't recognize, someone from a firm on the floor above hers, based on the visitor badge. They appeared to be wrapping up a conversation. Danwoo's back was initially to her, and then he turned. He saw her. The man he was speaking with said something that Danwoo didn't seem to hear anymore. Because Danwoo was looking at Sandra the way you look at something that stops you mid-thought. Sandra walked toward the cafe counter and ordered her coffee without breaking her stride. She was not going to make a scene. She was not going to give the lobby of her workplace the satisfaction of a dramatic moment. But Danwoo crossed the floor to where she was standing. He said her name, Sandra. It came out the way it always came out from him, like it was the only word in the sentence that mattered. Low, certain, like her name was something he kept somewhere safe and said carefully. She turned to look at him, and for about 4 seconds, the entire lobby of the building in Midtown Manhattan might as well have been empty. He looked at her, she looked at him, and Sandra asked him one question. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let anything show on her face. She simply looked at this man she had loved for 10 years and said, "Did you forget to tell me something, Danwoo?" Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked like guilt, like regret, like a man who knew exactly what he had walked into and had no prepared answer for it. He said he needed to explain, that it was more complicated than what she had seen, that he needed her to hear him out properly. He asked if she could meet him that evening, somewhere private, and he would explain everything. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. She collected her coffee. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk and did 3 hours of quality work. She was efficient. She was focused. Gerald Whitman, her director, a sharp and particular man who praised people the way other people ate broccoli, stopped by her desk that afternoon and told her the report she had submitted was excellent. She thanked him without missing a beat. At 5:30, she left the office. She went home. She changed out of her work clothes. She sat on her couch. She waited. 7 o'clock came. 8 o'clock. No Danwu. At 8:45, her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text, from a number she didn't have saved. The message read, "He's not coming, please stop waiting for him. A friend." Sandra read the message twice. She turned her phone over in her hand slowly. She looked across her apartment at the refrigerator where the food from the night before was still stored in neat containers. Then she set her phone on the cushion beside her. And something changed inside Sandra that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. It changed the way a locked door changes when the key is finally turned all the way, not broken, not forced, just opened, from the inside. She was done. Done waiting for a seat at a table that was being offered to someone else. Done making herself smaller to fit into the gaps of a man's life. Done being the woman who held on so long she forgot to ask herself whether holding on was still worth it. She was not angry, she was clear. And clarity, real, full, unhurried clarity, is the most dangerous thing a woman like Sandra can find. Watch what happens when she stops waiting. Sandra made 3 decisions the morning after the text message. She made them before her coffee was done brewing. She sat at her kitchen counter in a silk robe with her hair wrapped, and she thought through each decision carefully and completely before she committed to any of them. The first decision. She called her director Gerald Whitman before 9 in the morning and told him she was accepting the promotion. Gerald had been offering her the position for nearly 4 months. Senior portfolio lead, overseeing a major client account headquartered in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. It came with a salary increase, a quarterly travel schedule, and significantly more visibility within the firm. Sandra had been stalling on it quietly, without admitting to herself why. The role would require her to be in Los Angeles regularly. Part of her, the part that was still waiting, didn't want to be anywhere other than Manhattan in case Danwu needed to find her. She was done with that part. Gerald nearly dropped his phone. He told her the paperwork would be ready by end of week. The second decision, she called Camille. Camille Dubois was Sandra's closest friend. They had met in college at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and had remained inseparable across every city change, career pivot, and relationship since. Camille was 30 years old, razor-sharp, deeply loyal, and currently based in Houston, Texas, where she ran a successful event strategy firm. She was the kind of friend who asked the right questions and then actually listened to the answers. Sandra called her and told her everything, not the edited version, not the version where she minimized how much she had sacrificed, the full version, all 10 years of it. Camille listened without interrupting. When Sandra finished, Camille was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "I'm getting on a flight." She arrived the following Saturday morning with 2 carry-on bags, a box of her aunt's pralines from Houston, and the specific energy of a woman who had arrived to oversee a full rebuilding operation. The third decision, Sandra stopped shrinking. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that announced itself. She simply started making room for herself again. She accepted invitations she had previously declined. She let herself be fully present in rooms she used to only half enter because part of her mind was always somewhere else, always waiting, always listening for a notification, always holding space in the front of her thoughts for a man who was apparently not holding the same space for her. The shift was visible. She attended a rooftop networking event in Soho, Manhattan 2 weeks after accepting the promotion, and she was magnetic. She spoke with 3 senior partners from competing firms with the kind of confident clarity that made people stop conversations to listen. One of them, a woman who ran her own boutique investment advisory, handed Sandra her personal card at the end of the evening and said, "Call me. I don't do that often." Camille, standing 3 feet away with a glass of sparkling water, watched the whole thing and said nothing. But she smiled the kind of smile that said, "There she is." Camille also dragged Sandra to brunch in Brooklyn that same weekend. A long, loud, sprawling brunch at a restaurant on Fulton Street, where the waitstaff knew everyone by name, and the music was always exactly right. Sandra sat across from Camille and ate shrimp and grits and talked for 2 hours about everything except Danwu. About her career, about her plans, about what she wanted her life to look like in 5 years. And she laughed, genuinely, deeply, The kind of laugh that starts in your stomach and surprises you when it comes out. Camille looked at her across the table when the laughing settled and said quietly, "I missed you." Sandra understood exactly what she meant. It was also during this period that Sandra began to notice Rhett Calloway. Rhett was 32 years old, a Black American architect from Atlanta, Georgia, who had relocated to New York 3 years earlier to work with a design firm that had recently signed a contract with Sandra's company's real estate development division. He came into her professional orbit at a project coordination meeting where he was presenting preliminary building concepts, and Sandra was representing the financial compliance side. He was tall, quietly handsome in the way of someone who didn't think about it much. He had an easy humor that never felt performed, and a way of paying attention when someone spoke that made you feel like what you were saying was genuinely worth hearing. He did not pursue Sandra aggressively. He was not the man who turned everything into a competition or made his interest someone else's problem. He simply showed up, consistently, warmly, with good conversation, and the kind of patience that communicated that he had nothing to prove. He asked her to lunch after their third project meeting. She said yes. They spent an hour talking about architecture, food, and growing up in 2 very different American cities. He walked her back to her building afterward and said, "Same time next month when the next coordination meeting comes around." She said, "We'll see." But she went back inside smiling. Sandra was not falling for Rhett. She was not replacing Danwoo with someone new. She was simply, for the first time in years, allowing herself to feel the warmth of being seen by someone who was actually present. And across the city, in a high-rise suite in Tribeca, one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential corridors, something was happening with Danwoo that Sandra did not know about yet. He was sitting alone at the window of his suite at 11 at night, looking at the Manhattan skyline with his phone in his hand. The room was quiet. No staff, no associates, just him. Sandra's name was on his phone screen. His thumb was hovering over the call button. He sat there for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the table beside him and pressed his fist against his mouth and stared out at the lights of the city. He did not call. And the audience, watching this, felt something complicated, because Danwoo was not a simple villain in this story. He was a man who had made choices that cost someone deeply, and who was carrying the weight of those choices in a room by himself at 11 o'clock at night. But carrying weight quietly is not the same as being accountable for it. Sandra was not in that room. She did not see his hand hovering over her name. She was in Brooklyn, laughing at brunch, rediscovering herself. And she was moving. The truth starts leaking. 6 weeks after Sandra accepted the promotion, she flew to Los Angeles for the first time in her new role. The client was a Korean-American family office, a privately held wealth management structure representing one of the most significant Asian-American investment portfolios on the West Coast. The meeting was being held at a private venue in Beverly Hills, one of those low-profile, high-security locations that wealthy families used precisely because nobody could stumble into them. Sandra arrived with her junior associate Tasha, a 26-year-old from Detroit, Michigan, who was brilliant with numbers and had a habit of picking up on social tension before she fully understood what was causing it. They were shown into a meeting room that looked out over the rolling hills of Beverly Hills, the kind of view that reminded you why people spent everything they had to be in certain zip codes. Sandra set her materials on the table and reviewed her notes one final time. The stakeholders filed in. Sandra looked up to acknowledge them, and her eyes landed on Danwoo. He was sitting at the head of the table. For a full second, neither of them moved. Then Sandra blinked once and returned her gaze to her notes. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not shake. She smoothed her blazer once and looked back up at the room. Danwoo's expression was something she had never seen on his face before. Something that was not composure, was not calculation, was not the controlled authority he wore in every professional space. It was something raw and caught, like a man who had walked through a door and found a room he wasn't prepared for. He had not known she would be there. That much was clear. She had not known he would be there. They were stakeholders in the same client account. No one had connected those dots until this exact moment. The meeting ran for 2 hours. Sandra delivered her portion with precision and intelligence. She fielded 3 technical questions from other stakeholders without hesitation. She was the most prepared person in the room, and she made sure that showed, not because Danwoo was watching, but because she was always the most prepared person in every room and she was done pretending otherwise. Tasha sat beside her and did her job, and also spent significant energy glancing between Sandra and the man at the head of the table, with the expression of someone watching a documentary they hadn't realized they were a participant in. After the meeting, the stakeholders dispersed into smaller side conversations. Sandra collected her materials and walked toward the exit. Danwoo followed her into the parking structure. Her heels echoed on the concrete as she walked. She did not slow down, but she also did not run. Sandra. She stopped, turned around. He was standing 10 feet behind her, not too close, like he understood that he had forfeited certain proximity rights and was respecting that for now. He said, "I know I owe you an explanation." She looked at him. "You owe me more than that, but let's start there." He stepped closer. His voice was low, not quiet because he was being discreet, but because something in him was struggling to maintain its usual control. He said, "I was told you had moved on, that you were seeing someone, that you had stopped waiting and moved forward." Sandra stared at him. "Who told you that?" "A message, anonymous, over a year ago." She said nothing, let the silence breathe. "I believed it," he said, and then quieter. "Maybe I was looking for a reason not to be afraid of losing you, and someone handed me one." Sandra looked at this man, at the way he was standing in a concrete parking structure in Beverly Hills admitting something that cost him to admit, and she felt 10 different things at once. Anger, grief, something that was dangerously close to understanding. She said, "You should have called me, Danwoo, message or no message. You should have picked up the phone." He didn't argue. He just nodded, like he had been saying that same thing to himself in an empty room for months. She drove back to her hotel in West Hollywood and sat on the edge of the bed and called Camille. She told Camille what Danwoo said, about the anonymous message, about someone telling him she had moved on. Camille got very quiet on the other end of the call. Then she said, "Sandra, who had access to both of your contact information, who moved in both your circles." Sandra thought about it. "Someone close," she said slowly. "Exactly," Camille said, "and I'm going to find out who." Camille was an event strategist. She spent her professional life coordinating between networks of people, which meant she had both the skill and the contacts to trace social information with significant precision. She spent the next 5 days working quietly. She called Sandra on a Thursday evening and said, "I don't have the name yet, but I have a lead. And Sandra, this wasn't an accident. Someone did this on purpose." Sandra pressed her back against the headboard of her hotel bed and stared at the ceiling of her West Hollywood hotel room. The audience at this point was already in the comments, guessing, theorizing, because Camille had given them just enough without giving them everything. That was exactly where Sandra was too. Seo-yoon is not the villain. Sandra's firm sent her to Scottsdale, Arizona 3 weeks later. It was an executive weekend retreat, the kind that high-end financial firms hosted for their top-tier client roster once or twice a year. 3 days at a private resort in the desert outside Scottsdale, with golf and spa sessions in the morning and structured networking in the afternoon. Sandra was there representing the firm as a newly promoted portfolio lead, which meant she was hosting several of the smaller roundtable sessions. She did not expect to see Seo-yoon there. But on the first evening, during the opening reception on the resort terrace, warm desert air, string lights, the specific easy elegance of Scottsdale money, Sandra looked across the room and saw her. Seo-yoon Lim, standing near the edge of the terrace with a glass in her hand and the expression of someone who had learned to look comfortable in rooms that made her anything but. Sandra's stomach tightened. She held herself still and made a decision. She would be professional. She would not make anything awkward. She did not know this woman's full story. She was not going to project. She kept her distance that first evening. But on the second morning, the retreat organizers placed them in the same small group session, a round table of 8 people discussing cross-border investment challenges. Sandra facilitated. Seo Yoon was one of the participants, representing her family's investment arm. They were professional, measured. They did not acknowledge that they knew who the other was. The session ran for 90 minutes. Seo Yoon was sharp. Her contributions were intelligent and well-considered, and Sandra noted privately, with a fairness she was proud of, that the woman was more capable than most people in the room gave her credit for. After the session ended and the group dispersed, Sandra stayed to collect her notes. Seo Yoon lingered near the door, not obviously waiting, but not quite leaving either. Then Seo Yoon said, to no one and everyone at once, or maybe just to the room, in the way that people say things out loud when they've been holding them too long. I am so tired of being someone's arrangement. Sandra's hands stilled on her papers. Seo Yoon was looking out the window at the Scottsdale desert landscape, red rock and blue sky, and the particular clarity that Arizona air has in the morning. She wasn't crying. She was just honest. Sandra said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, "How long have you known Danwoo?" The silence that followed was significant. Seo Yoon turned from the window and looked at Sandra directly, and something crossed her expression recognition, then something that looked almost like relief. She said, "You're Sandra." It was not a question. Sandra looked back at her steadily. She didn't confirm or deny, but her eyes did. Seo Yoon let out a long breath. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, protectively, like she was holding herself together while she said something that mattered. My father introduced us 18 months ago. It was framed as a business meeting that turned into a social introduction. He had been planning it for much longer than that. There is a merger between the Lim family assets and the Kwon organization, and my father decided that a personal connection between Danwoo and me would make that merger more stable, more permanent. Sandra listened without moving. I was not asked whether I wanted this, Seo Yoon continued. I was told, and I am my father's only daughter, and the business is everything he built his life around, and I love him even when he is wrong, so I agreed. She paused. Danwoo was not unkind to me. He was respectful, he was never inappropriate, but he was also somewhere else, always. Even in the same room, he was somewhere else. Sandra felt something move in her chest that she couldn't name. He talked about you, Seo Yoon said. Her voice was quieter now. Not often, but in the way that people say the important things without meaning to small references, pauses in conversation, a way his expression changed when something reminded him of someone he wasn't talking about. He never spoke about me the way he spoke about you. Not once. Sandra looked at this woman, this Korean woman she had spent weeks imagining as her replacement, her opposite, the woman chosen over her, and saw something completely different. She saw someone else who had been placed in the middle of a situation she didn't design and didn't fully choose. They were not enemies. They were two different women who had both been affected by choices made around them and above them, and neither of them was the cause of the other's pain. Sandra said, "I'm sorry that was done to you." Seo Yoon looked slightly surprised, like she hadn't expected that. "I'm sorry for what was done to you as well." They stood in that room for a quiet moment, not as rivals, not as friends exactly, but as two people who had come to an honest understanding in the desert air of Scottsdale, Arizona. Then Seo Yoon said, "The message that Danwoo received, the one telling him you had moved on, I think I know who sent it." Sandra went very still. There is someone in Danwoo's inner circle who stood to benefit significantly from this arrangement going forward. Someone who would lose something important if Danwoo had stayed connected to you. I heard a conversation I was not supposed to hear, months ago. I did not fully understand it at the time, but now, given everything you've just confirmed for me, I believe I do. Sandra looked at her. "Who?" she asked. Seo Yoon said a name. "Kevin Ma." Sandra sat with that name for a long time after Seo Yoon said it. Kevin Ma, 34 years old. Danwoo's personal coordinator and one of the most trusted people in his inner circle for the past 8 years. A Korean-American man who had grown up between Los Angeles and Seoul, who spoke both English and Korean with equal fluency, and who had always presented himself as fiercely loyal to Danwoo. Sandra knew Kevin, not closely, but enough. She had seen him at social gatherings over the years. She had exchanged pleasantries with him at the 2 dinners Danwoo brought her to when he was in New York. He had always been cordial to her, professional, warm enough not to be suspicious. She flew back to Manhattan and called Camille from the car on the way from JFK. Camille had already been building her trail. When Sandra told her the name Kevin Ma, Camille went quiet for 3 seconds and then said, "That matches where my information was pointing. I just didn't have the name tied to it yet." Together, they started putting the pieces together methodically. What emerged over the following days was a picture that Sandra had to sit with very carefully, because it was infuriating and precise in equal measure. Kevin Ma's family had a long-standing but quietly maintained financial relationship with the Lim family, Seo Yoon's family. The connection was through a secondary investment vehicle that both families had stakes in, a private equity structure based in Seoul that held assets across Asia and had partial exposure to the American market through a fund housed in San Francisco. The value of that fund and the Ma family's position in it was directly tied to the strength of the Lim Kwon business merger. If the merger went through cleanly and the Kwon organization maintained a strong alliance with the Lim family, the fund's value increased significantly. Kevin's family stood to gain a considerable amount from that outcome. If Danwoo had stayed committed to Sandra, a woman with no connection to the Korean business networks, no family alliance to offer, no merger to support, there was a real possibility that Danwoo would have resisted or delayed the arrangement his father was pushing. Danwoo had resisted his father before. He was not a man who did things purely because he was told to. Kevin knew this. He had watched Danwoo for 8 years. He knew exactly how much Sandra mattered to him. He knew that Sandra was the variable that could disrupt everything. So he removed the variable. The anonymous message Danwoo received, sent from a burner account through a platform Danwoo used for private communications, told him that Sandra had quietly moved on, that she had been spending time with someone new, that she had stopped wearing the bracelet he gave her, that she seemed lighter and happier than she had been in years, and it seemed like she was letting go. Danwoo had received it during one of the most vulnerable periods of his time in Seoul, when his father's health was deteriorating and the pressure of the organization was heaviest. He was exhausted and stretched and afraid of things he would not say out loud to anyone. And someone handed him a story that let him believe the loss had already happened, that Sandra had already made her choice, that his absence had cost him the one thing he hadn't been able to protect. Kevin had also intercepted, not deleted, but delayed, several of the messages Sandra had sent during the 8 months of silence. He had used his position as Danwoo's personal coordinator to manage Danwoo's communications during a high-stress period, which gave him access and timing that he used carefully. He didn't block Sandra entirely. He just made sure her messages arrived at the wrong moments, buried under other things, easy to misread as casual when Danwoo was already in the mindset that she had moved on. It was quiet, surgical, the kind of betrayal that didn't announce itself because it was dressed up as management. Camille pulled documentation through her network, screenshots, timestamps, digital footprints that told the story clearly when you laid them out in order. She was not a detective, but she was extremely good at connecting networks of information, and she did it with the focus of someone who was personally offended on behalf of her best friend. She packaged everything neatly and sent it to Sandra on a Tuesday night. Sandra sat at her kitchen counter in her Manhattan apartment and read through everything slowly. Once, then again. She thought about the 10 years, the relationships she had turned down, the cities she had stayed away from, the San Francisco man, the promotion she had delayed, the version of herself she had kept on hold, not because she was weak, but because she had made a commitment to something she believed in. All of it, every single piece of it, touched by one man's calculated decision to move her out of the way for money. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Danwoo. He picked up on the second ring. She said 4 words. "We need to talk." His voice on the other end was quiet, but certain, like he had been waiting for exactly this. He said, "Tell me where." Danwoo was in California on business, staying at a private residence in Atherton, a small city in San Mateo County that sat between San Francisco and San Jose and was consistently ranked as one of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States. It was the kind of place where the houses sat behind long driveways and mature trees, and where the silence was the expensive kind. Sandra flew to San Francisco 2 days later. She took a car from SFO to Atherton in the late afternoon, the Bay Area light doing that particular golden thing it does in the hours before sunset, falling through the trees along the highway like something deliberate. She was composed. She had been composed for weeks, but this was a different kind of composure, not the kind that holds something in, but the kind that has already made its peace with what it's about to say. The residence was a single-story modern structure set back from the road behind a large lawn, understated from the outside, immaculate within. A staff member let Sandra in and led her to a sitting room that looked out onto a private garden. She was not left waiting long. Danwoo walked in and stopped when he saw her. She was sitting with her bag on the seat beside her and her hands resting in her lap, perfectly still, perfectly present. She had dressed simply. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, her natural hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like herself, which he would later tell her was the most undoing thing about seeing her that evening. He sat down across from her. She opened her bag and took out the documents Camille had compiled. She laid them on the low table between them, not dramatically, not as a performance, but with the same methodical confidence she brought to every client meeting. She was going to present what she had the way she presented financial findings, clearly, chronologically, and without unnecessary theater. She walked him through everything. Kevin's family's stake in the Lim Fund, the financial structure that tied the Ma family's gains to the Limquan merger, the burner account, the timeline of the anonymous message against the timeline of Danwoo's behavior changes, the intercepted messages, the digital trail that Camille had helped piece together. She spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. Danwoo listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for the documents. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he looked at Sandra, not at the papers, at Sandra, and listened. And with every piece of information she laid out, his face changed. Not dramatically. Danwoo was not a man given to dramatic expression, but Sandra knew his face. She had known his face for 12 years. And she watched the composure that made him formidable in every boardroom and business setting, the composure that his associates feared and his opponents misjudged, come apart, layer by layer, quietly. By the time she finished speaking, the room was very still. Danwoo sat back slowly. He pressed his fingers together. He looked at the documents on the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. He said, "Kevin." Not a question, a recognition. Sandra said nothing. He said, "I trusted him with everything. He knew every part of my life for 8 years." "I know," Sandra said. The silence stretched. Then Danwoo said, "I should have called you anyway, message or no message. Even if I believed you had moved on, I should have called. I should have heard it from you. I was afraid, Sandra, and I let someone use that fear against both of us." Sandra looked at him steadily. She was not going to rush this. She was not going to tell him it was fine. It was not fine. But she was also not going to pretend that she didn't hear the honesty in what he was saying. She said, "Tell me your side, all of it." He did. He told her about the night his father called him back, about arriving in Seoul to find an organization in fracture, internal disputes, financial hemorrhaging, a power structure that had been quietly destabilizing for 2 years before anyone admitted it out loud. He told her about the pressure his father put on him. The expectation that he would not just fix things, but do it in a way that protected the family's legacy and reputation across every dimension, including social and political alliances. He told her about the conversation with his father regarding Seo Yoon, how it was not a request but a structural expectation wrapped in family loyalty, and how he had resisted it for months because of Sandra. He told her about receiving the message, about reading it at 2 in the morning on the worst night of a very bad month, about sitting with it for 3 days before he allowed himself to believe it, and then about the slow, quiet collapse of resistance that happened after, when he told himself that maybe his father's arrangement was inevitable now that Sandra had already moved forward. He told her about the night he was in Tribeca with her name on his phone and his thumb over the call button. Sandra listened to all of it without a word. When he finished, the garden outside the window was blue with early evening, and the room was lit by the soft overhead light. Sandra said, "You spent 10 years making me feel like I wasn't worth a phone call, and I spent 10 years proving to myself that I was." She let that sit. "The question is, what are you going to do with that?" Danwoo stood up. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, not too close, not asking for anything, just present. More present than she had seen him be in years, maybe ever. He said, "I'm going to fix it, all of it, starting with Kevin." His voice was not loud, but there was something underneath it that Sandra recognized, the particular quality of a man who had made a real decision, not a performance, not a promise designed to get something, a decision. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, picked up her bag, and said, "I'm staying at a hotel in San Francisco tonight. You know how to reach me." She walked out of that house in Atherton and got back into the car and watched the Bay Area evening passing outside the window all the way back to the city. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something that wasn't waiting and wasn't grief and wasn't the heavy stillness of a woman holding herself in place. She felt like herself. Danwoo moved on Kevin within 72 hours. He did it the way that powerful men do things when they are truly serious, not with noise, not with theater, but with absolute precision. He called Kevin into a private meeting at the Tribeca suite the morning after Sandra left Atherton. He did not tell Kevin what he knew in advance. He did not give him time to prepare. When Kevin walked in, he found Danwoo seated and composed, the real version of composed, not the version that was performing anything for anyone. Danwoo laid the documentation on the table. Kevin looked at it, and the thing about a man who has been living inside a carefully constructed lie for a long time is that when the structure collapses, it collapses completely. Kevin's face changed in a way that confirmed everything before he said a single word. He tried to explain, then he tried to minimize. He said the merger was important. He said he did it for the organization. He said Danwoo needed to focus, and Sandra was a distraction from what truly mattered. Danwoo listened to all of it. Then he told Kevin 3 things. First, his position within the organization was terminated, effective immediately. Every access, every credential, every connection gone. Second, the details of what Kevin had done would be shared with the relevant parties in their business network, not as a public announcement, not as a spectacle, but as a factual disclosure to anyone who needed to know. In business circles like theirs, that was sufficient. Reputation was currency, and Kevin had just declared bankruptcy. Third, if Kevin ever attempted to insert himself into any matter involving Sandra or anyone connected to her, the consequences would be significant and immediate. Kevin left the room. Danwoo sat quietly for a while afterward, not with satisfaction, but with the specific gravity of a man who has just dismantled something he built with his own trust. 8 years. Kevin had been there for 8 years, and he had used every one of those years to position himself close enough to cause this level of damage. It was a lesson Danwoo would not need to be taught twice. The business arrangement with the Lim family was the next matter. Danwoo had a long and difficult conversation with his father. The narrator describes it as the most honest conversation the Kwon family had in a generation. Danwoo's father was not a soft man. He was the kind of man who had built an empire by making decisions that served the whole above the individual. But he was also, beneath the authority and the tradition, a father who had watched his son carry the weight of the Kwon organization without complaint for 7 years. Danwoo told him plainly, the personal arrangement with Seo Yoon was not something he could continue. Not because he disrespected the Lim family, but because it was not honest, and Danwoo had built his professional life on being honest in every negotiation he entered. He would not be less honest in the most personal dimension of his existence. His father was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised Danwoo. He said, "I always knew you would push back on this eventually. I just thought it would be sooner." They restructured the merger agreement. The business partnership between the Kwon organization and the Lim family was preserved and formalized through proper professional channels, no personal arrangement attached. Both families' legal and financial representatives signed off within 2 weeks. The merger was actually stronger for it, because it was now built on commercial value alone, rather than an interpersonal arrangement that neither of the key parties had genuinely chosen. Seo-yoon was informed privately. Her response was a single sentence: "Thank you." She returned to Seoul and wasted no time. She had been sitting on a hospitality concept for 2 years, a boutique hotel brand that drew from Korean cultural design principles and was intended for the luxury travel market. With the family pressure removed, she moved forward with it immediately. She hired a design team and a business development lead, and within 6 months would announce the brand's debut property in Jeju Island. Before she left for Seoul, she sent Sandra a short message. "Take care of him better than we ever let him take care of himself." Sandra read the message twice. She did not respond right away. She set her phone on the counter and stood at her kitchen window in Manhattan and looked out at the city for a minute. Then she smiled, quietly, the way Sandra did most things without announcement. She put the phone in her bag and got ready for work. Because Sandra's life was not on pause while any of this was unfolding, it never went back on pause. The Beverly Hills client portfolio was performing exceptionally. Her quarterly review numbers were among the strongest in her division. Gerald Whitman sent her an email, not a passive compliment dropped in a hallway, but an actual written email saying she was doing impressive work. Her colleague Priya texted her to say the whole floor was talking about her numbers. She flew to Los Angeles twice more that quarter and each time found a rhythm in the city that surprised her. She liked the particular pace of Beverly Hills and the late afternoon light in West Hollywood, and the way the coast looked from the highway when she had a free hour and drove toward it just because she could. Camille flew up from Houston for a long weekend in Manhattan, and they went to Chelsea and ate at a restaurant that required a 2-month reservation, and stayed at the table for 3 hours talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. And Rhett, warm, consistent, unhurried Rhett, remained a presence in Sandra's professional orbit that was also becoming something else. Something steady. He never pushed. He never demanded. He just showed up with good energy and real conversation, and the particular gift of making Sandra feel like her company was something he genuinely valued, not something he was trying to secure for himself. Sandra had not made any decisions about Rhett. She was not in a rush. For the first time in 10 years, she was not in a rush about anything. And then a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text. A physical letter, handwritten, delivered to her firm's mailroom and collected by the front desk with Sandra's name written on the envelope in precise, careful handwriting. She opened it at her desk during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was from Danwoo. He did not begin with an apology. He had already said what he needed to say in Atherton, and he was not a man who repeated himself as performance. He began by saying he was writing because some things should not be sent in a format that can be forwarded or deleted or misread in a context it wasn't meant for. He wrote about Sandra, about who she was not to him, not in relation to him, but as a person he had watched build a life with care and intelligence and a quiet dignity that he had never stopped being moved by. He wrote about the 12 years he had known her and the version of himself he had been when he was with her, more honest, more present, less armored. He wrote about his failures. He named them specifically, not as a bid for sympathy, but as evidence that he understood what had happened and where he had fallen short. Then he said, "I am not asking you to come back to what we were. What we were is gone and it deserved to go, because it was built on waiting and distance and a faith that I did not honor the way it deserved. I am asking you for something different. I am asking for the chance to show you something new, something built differently, with both of us present this time. I know that is not a small thing to ask. I understand if you have moved too far forward to look back in any direction. But I needed you to know that what I want, if you will allow it, is you. Not because of history, because of who you are right now." He ended the letter with a single line. "You once told me not to make you regret waiting. I cannot undo what happened, but I can make sure that whatever comes next, you never regret it." Sandra put the letter down on her desk. She looked at the Manhattan skyline through her office window. She did not respond that day. She did not respond the following week. She sat with it, the way Sandra sat with everything important, Thoroughly, honestly, without rushing toward a conclusion just because the conclusion was available. The narrator held the tension. The audience was on the edge of their seats. 3 months passed. Sandra was in San Francisco. She was there as a keynote speaker at a major financial summit, an annual event hosted at one of the city's most prestigious hotels in the financial district, drawing 400 senior executives, portfolio managers, and investment professionals from across the country. Sandra had been invited 6 weeks earlier by an organizing committee that included the woman from the Soho networking event who had handed Sandra her personal card and said, "Call me. I don't do that often." Sandra had called. They had built a working relationship, and that relationship had led to this invitation. She stood backstage in a fitted charcoal dress and her natural hair styled the way she liked it best, full and uncompromising, and she reviewed her notes one final time. Her assistant handed her a glass of water. She took a sip. She breathed. Then she walked out onto the stage. The room was full. 400 people, professionally dressed and professionally attentive, the kind of audience that arrived with high expectations and showed warmth only when it was earned. Sandra earned it within the first 4 minutes. She spoke about long-term value, about the discipline of knowing what to hold and when to release, about the difference between patience and stagnation, about how the most successful portfolios are not built by people who wait passively for returns, but by people who actively choose, repeatedly and deliberately, where to place their faith and their energy. She spoke for 40 minutes. She got a standing ovation. Afterward, she moved through the reception with the ease of someone who belonged in every room and knew it. She spoke with 3 executives she had never met and exchanged contact information with 2 of them. She found Tasha, her junior associate, who had accompanied her to Lowe's Angels all those months ago and never forgot the look on Dan Wu's face in that Beverly Hills meeting room. And they debriefed over sparkling water and said very little about the keynote because they both knew it went well, and neither of them was given to unnecessary commentary. At 7:30 in the evening, the formal portion of the summit concluded. Sandra stepped outside onto the hotel terrace. The San Francisco Bay stretched out before her, the Bay Bridge lit in the distance, the water doing that dark silver thing it does when the evening light hits it from the right angle. The air was cool, the specific cool of a San Francisco evening that is not cold but tells you clearly that you are on a coast and the ocean is not far. She stood at the railing and breathed it in. Dan Wu was standing at the far end of the terrace. He was not dramatically positioned. He was not in a spotlight or silhouetted against the skyline in a way that announced itself. He was simply standing there, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the same view she had just turned to face, and he turned his head when she stepped out, the way people turn toward movement when they have been waiting for something specific. Sandra looked at him. She did not pretend to be surprised. She was not. She had known somewhere in the part of herself that she had spent 3 months being very honest with, that the absence of her response to his letter was a kind of conversation. She had not said no. She had not said yes. She had been thinking. And Danwu, who had known her for 12 years, and had made the mistake of allowing doubt to substitute for the direct choice of reaching for her once before, was not going to make that mistake again. He crossed the terrace to where she was standing. He stopped at a respectful distance. She said, "You flew to San Francisco." He said, "You didn't respond to my letter." "I know. I figured silence meant come find you." She looked at him. Something moved in the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile yet. "It meant I was thinking." And the terrace was quiet. Somewhere below them, the city moved with its own constant rhythm, the specific aliveness of San Francisco at night, the bridge lights and the water and the sound of a city that had been built on risk and reinvention. Sandra turned to face him fully. She looked at Dan Wu-Kwon, this man she had loved since she was 22 years old in a Brooklyn apartment at a birthday party, where she told a handsome stranger he looked like he was calculating something. This man who had asked her to wait and whom she had waited for across 10 years and 2 continents, and more loneliness than she had ever allowed herself to fully count. This man who had been deceived by someone he trusted, and who had not fought hard enough past that deception, and who had spent the last several months, imperfectly, gradually, and with genuine effort, trying to be accountable for that. She looked at him with clear eyes. She said, "I am not the woman you left behind, Danwoo. I want you to understand that completely before we have any other conversation. The woman you left behind waited quietly and held herself in place and made herself small enough to fit into the gaps of your life. I am not her anymore." He was listening, fully, the way he should have listened years ago. "If you want this, whatever this is, you are starting with the woman standing in front of you right now. Not who I was, who I am. And who I am does not wait. Who I am does not shrink. Who I am is building a life that is full and real and entirely hers, and anyone who wants to be part of it has to be willing to show up for all of it, not the convenient parts, not the parts that fit around other commitments. All of it." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Danwoo looked at her for a long moment. And then he said something that Sandra did not expect, not because it was elaborate, but because it was the simplest and most honest thing he had said to her in 12 years. "Honestly, I don't know yet. I know who I want to be for you. I know what I should have been. I know what I'm committed to becoming. But I won't stand here and tell you I've already arrived somewhere I'm still walking toward. What I can tell you is that I'm walking, and I'm not going to stop." Sandra absorbed that. She thought about what he had just said, the absence of performance in it, the willingness to admit incompleteness rather than dress up a polished promise. She had been with men, or adjacent to men, who offered polished promises. She knew what those felt like. They felt like contracts written in water. This felt like something solid. She said, "Then walk." She turned back to face the bay for a moment. Then she turned back to him and said, "There's a restaurant in Nob Hill that Camille told me I had to try while I was here. I was going to go alone. You can come if you want." He said, "I want." They walked off that terrace together, not with their hands intertwined yet, not with everything resolved, not with a ribbon tied around the complexity of 12 years and 10 of them spent waiting. They walked off that terrace as two people who had been through something real and come out the other side of it with a cleaner and more honest version of what they were to each other. And that, the narrator told the audience, was actually better than the fairy tale. Because the fairy tale would have given Sandra a man who showed up perfectly and said all the right things without cost. And Sandra did not need a fairy tale. Sandra needed something true. Over the following months, they built it properly. Danwoo relocated his primary base of operations to New York. Not because Sandra asked him to. She had made very clear she was not in the business of asking men to relocate. But because the American market was genuinely strategic for the Kwon organization's next phase, and because Manhattan was where Sandra was. And for the first time in 7 years, he was organizing his life around what he actually wanted rather than what was expected of him. He was present, in the way the letter had promised, in the small and steady ways, not the grand gestures. He showed up to things. He called when he said he would call. He listened without his mind being somewhere else. He met Camille, who looked at him across a dinner table in Brooklyn for about 20 minutes before she said, "You have a lot of making up to do," he said. "I know." Camille decided that was the right answer. He met Rhett at a work function that Sandra attended, and Danwoo accompanied her too. And it was not awkward, because Sandra was not a woman who allowed the past and the present to collide without managing the collision thoughtfully. Rhett was cordial and gracious, and the kind of man who did not make things unnecessarily complicated. He read the room, and he respected Sandra's choices, and he remained what he had always been, a good person in Sandra's professional and personal orbit who wished her well. Sandra's career continued to ascend. She closed a landmark portfolio deal that brought her firm 3 new high-value clients and earned her a feature in a financial industry publication, a short profile piece with a photo that made Camille screenshot it and send it to 17 people. She spoke to her mother every Sunday. She went to Houston to see Camille in the spring. She flew to Los Angeles for work and started loving the West Coast with a new openness that she hadn't allowed herself before. She bought herself something she had been putting off for 4 years, a piece of original artwork by a black painter whose work she had admired at a gallery in Harlem. She hung it on the main wall of her Manhattan apartment and sat across from it with her morning coffee on a Saturday and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had stopped delaying her own joy. And the last image the narrator gives the audience. Sandra, sitting on the couch in her apartment on a quiet Sunday evening, the artwork on the wall, the city outside the window. Danwoo beside her, not performing, not managing anything, just there. He is reading something on his phone, and she is reviewing something on her laptop, and neither of them is talking because they do not need to fill the silence to prove that something real is in the room with them. He glances over at her at one point. She doesn't look up from her laptop, but she says, "Stop starring." He says, "I'm not starring, I'm appreciating." She looks up, their eyes meet. And she smiles, the real one, the deep one, the one from the stomach. He smiles back. The narrator delivers the final line over that image. She didn't go back to where she was. She moved forward, and this time he had to keep up with her. Sandra waited 10 years. She got lied on, left behind, and still came out standing. But here's what gets me, she never stopped being herself through all of it. That's the real story. Tell me in the comments, was she right to give Danwoo another chance? Or would you have walked away for good? Drop your answer below.